Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from the United States of America, here in Iowa, Des Moines. 8 years, folks. We are celebrating 8 years today, the 8-year anniversary of the first time we broadcast the show. And Bud, I don't know if you got to go back and listen to that show, but we were not good.
Yeah,
I think we're a lot better now, and I am glad that you guys have been patient with us as we've grown into the lean, mean radio machine that we are now. I'm Bo Bonner, Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives over at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Bud, what is your position on the team?
I'm Bud Marr. I'm also at Mercy College of Health Sciences. I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I just want to say, Nick Saban lost to nobody, some no-name school his first year at Alabama.
Absolutely. If you talk about a program turnaround, yeah. I would say 8 years is pretty quick. What is that when I'm really bringing it out of nowhere, but Conan O'Brien had like a 10-year anniversary, and Mr. T gave him a necklace that said like 7 or something like that. And he's like, we've been on for 10 years. And he's like, yeah, but you were only good for the last 7. Maybe that applies to us. I'm not going to say the year that we got good, but I'm very happy that we've had the opportunity to be here for 8 years, 8 trips around the sun here for the Uncommon Good. Glad that everybody has joined us, whether that be on the airwaves, on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or our wonderful podcast listeners. And Bud, one thing I will say that has been steady the entire time is we want to say thank you to Mercy College of Health Sciences for underwriting the show, mchs.edu. 8 years of putting up with us. Thank you, Mercy College.
Yeah, and it's been an exciting start to the fall. We've really saw sort of an uptick in some of our science courses. I know our sonography program recently expanded. I think that helped our cause, but it's cool to see high demand for anatomy, physics, chemistry. A lot of learning going on in these hallways.
Kicking into high gear, just like football season's kicking into high gear, so is the learning season. So passing, running, blocking, learning, it's all happening. mchs.edu. No, but I really did go back and listen, and I think we had some good things to say. Do you know what we did that was crazy? Is we both talked really slow.
Oh.
I think we have the back and forth, raring to go. I think that's where the confidence mostly lies. We did have, we used to do great moments in church history, and I think we leaned on that a lot to really help us wrap the show up. I'm not giving us a D. I was like overblowing it. C plus B minus. I'm really impressed about how far the show has come, and the rapport, to use a French word, that we've developed here on the airwaves.
Well, you know, I was completely new to radio. If anyone out there, I think they can sympathize with, I think most persons don't like listening to recordings of themselves. It just, you sound different in your own ear. And so I'm glad you've done the yeoman's work to go back and listen to some of those early shows. I don't think I'm going to, but I trust you that we've improved. It's like anything in life, getting into the octagon or whatever you get. I think experience is almost more important than any sort of like manual training.
You don't quite get the bloody noses in the octagon of being on air, but I do think you get the experience about how to cheer. What's the dumb line we should have done here? Finish each other's, and then you say
thoughts
or sandwiches, right? That's the joke. So we've been at this 8 years. We told everyone last year, we warned you. And what are we doing? We are reconsidering the initial episodes where we talked about the principles of Catholic social teaching. And I will give us another thumbs up, but I like that we started with peace because, there's all sorts of arguments about what you start with. And if you see a sort of very technical list of Catholic social teaching principles, you might not see peace. It depends on what who you're running into. But the foundational notion of getting peace correct and what we mean by peace, I think that is more than half the whole in talking about the Catholic social teaching, because the idea of what order itself means and how it emanates from God is beyond important. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, as after 8 years, we're reconsidering those first episodes where we're talking about the principles of Catholic social teaching. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It's been 8 years on the day that we've been on the airwaves with you. Thank you, everyone who listens to Iowa Catholic Radio, listening to The Uncommon Good, our 8th year anniversary. So we have decided to go back and reconsider those first shows where we talked about the principles of Catholic social teaching. Some things, of course, have changed, Bud. We alluded that we're both better at this whole radio gig. We also have the Eagle Screech. I'll have to go back and just when that became a fixture of the show, but it's been years at this point. What else?
There are some funny moments, because I remember with the Eagle Screech, I can't remember the moment of inspiration, but we used it. And then we talked about a sort of, how do you call it? Not a sweepstakes, but we were going to kind of poll our audience about which animal sound was most appropriate.
Oh, right.
I think there might be an older show that actually has a cat's meow.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, there's a horse. We did a lot of them, and then someone called in and said, you have to go back to the Eagle Screech. Yeah. It's like yours, and
He's
said,
like, I'm going to
yes,
stop
ma'am.
listening unless it's the Eagle Screech or something.
I mean, I don't want to presume, but it did sound like someone with a firm grandma type tone, and she was like, you guys need to go back. It has to be the Eagle Screech, and so we salute the listener for getting us back on track. So we've learned a lot. We've come into our full form, and we're going to reconsider these things. But I will say the thing that we started out with that was absolutely correct is too often peace gets relegated to a negative term. So usually what it seems to me in the contemporary world, when people talk about peace, they mean the absence of war. But if you think about that, that starts to make peace akin to something like cold or darkness, right? Darkness is the lack of light. Cold is the lack of heat. Certainly we don't want to say that peace is a negative trait. We want to say that it's foundational. So the classic Catholic understanding is to say that peace is the tranquility of order. And I think we can unpack that as we go along. But Bud, maybe for a bit of historical reasons that we didn't really get into. We had a shorter show back then too. It was only 30 minutes. Do you mind telling the good listeners where we got this idea to do this for the first show? Because it comes from the classes that we taught.
Yeah, so this is one of those conversations where the ideas that we're going to talk about are so much in the water that oftentimes we don't think about them. And what I mean by that is there's this whole tradition of philosophy, these kind of arguments and conversations that have gone on since the 16th century that have influenced the way that the founders of our country sort of structured the social order. And now we live in that world. But I mean, for a lot of reasons, mainly because like most of our listeners are not total nerds, we don't oftentimes like step back and reflect on those things. So when Bo mentions class and our servant leadership course here at Mercy College of Health Sciences, we often try to like expose our students to this conversation that has taken place because it is really important. It really flows out of, so like we can get into this in more depth, but like the 4,000 foot view, is it 4,000 or 40,000?
I thought it was 30,000.
30,000. I think, yeah.
After 8 years, we've added 10,000 more feet. We're that much more wise.
I always forget planes say they taxi. I think you're right. 4,000 you'd be running into buildings.
That's
maybe.
right. That's right.
So anyways, this is the higher view of this sort of thing. But in the 16th century and after the time of the Reformation, there's some really just sort of like terrible wars that take place on the continent. And as folks are kind of processing that, go ahead. You look like you're...
Oh, the European continent.
What did I say?
The continent.
The continent.
Yeah,
it is.
It's one of the continents. Keep going, sorry.
So often called the wars of religion, that gets really complex and sort of thorny. Recently, there's been some revisionist history to say, like, you can call this the wars of religion, but in a lot of ways, these are wars driven by princes seeking to consolidate power. And the reason why that's brought up is like oftentimes those who are in combat, like it crossed religious lines. You had sometimes like Catholics fighting other Catholics, etc. But it was precipitated after the time of the Reformation. And these wars were devastating and had a huge psychological impact on Europe. So around that time, Thomas Hobbes, born in 1588, he wrote most of his philosophy, of course, in the next century.
To make a joke back from the 8 years ago, not the tiger.
Not the tiger. My kids are huge Calvin Hobbes fans. So the tiger is an homage to the philosopher. But anywho, so he's basically wrestling with like what's caused this. How can our culture, our country be placed back on right footing again? And so Hobbes, he basically says in short that Christianity, which used to provide this kind of social cohesiveness, no longer is up to the task. And he says like we have to find a new way forward. And for Hobbes, there's a lot we could say about his philosophy, but he looks at human society and says human society is sort of like, it papers over the fact that at the heart of human relations is actually violence. So he says, really, like if you strip away all the niceties, what you have at base is what he calls the war of all against all, like human beings set against each other in conflict. And the answer to that is to wrest, not peace, but I think is even order is kind of an imprecise term.
Well, if you think when he goes forward, he talks about a social contract, which to me is very interesting that most modern social contract theories trace their history back to Thomas Hobbes. Social contract usually gets thrown out like it's a very sort of optimistic philosophy. In the hands of Thomas Hobbes, and I think people inherit it whether they like it or not, it's very pessimistic because anything, order, peace, whatever you want to say, boundaries is really what he's getting at, is what you have to do is work very hard and use any means necessary to make a boundary in which the violence is outside of the boundary, and inside the boundary, there's what I think Christians have to call the counterfeit of peace, which again is the lack of this conflict that he thinks is inimical to all human relations and is basically the foundational root and branch of any human society. And so for him, you really do have to say, what is a force strong enough to maintain for people within the boundary, within the regime, within the realm, a sort of life they would want to live at the expense of, as it were, casting to the outer darkness, the sort of violence inherent in what it means for humans to be together.
Yeah, and so for him, if you think about if he's approaching human relationships as fundamentally conflictual, and like Bo said, trying to establish a society where some of that's policed, what he basically says is that what we do as citizens of a polis, of a city-state or country, is that each of us gives up our own sort of prerogative to protect ourselves, to take revenge in certain situations. And we turn that over to, he used the term Leviathan. So if you've ever done, Bible studies with the Old Testament, you get into the book of Job or something, there's this ancient creature. It was like supposed to be the greatest of all the sea creatures. And the name for that was Leviathan. I was trying to find it real quickly. There's a verse in Job that says like, there's no creature more majestic than Leviathan. And so Hobbes, that's the term that he gives to the governing body.
Yeah, this emergent thing that we come to know as the nation state. So there's, of course, nations, there's states for a long time, but this conception that we have to make a social contract where we hand over something that we have by right, which is the use of violence, so that there can be, as it were, a creature, and I put that in scare quotes, but I mean, he really thinks of it as sort of a creation that has, so as it were, enough violence to police the boundary. This is where the social contract begins.
So if you look at the frontispiece of this book that he wrote, Leviathan, it's his most famous work. It's a really interesting piece of artwork because you see at the front of the image this kind of tranquil medieval town. It looks like a rural European, depiction of idyllic life or whatever. And then hovering over the town is this large regal figure, like a king, who holds a kingly scepter in one hand and a sword in the other. But as you look more closely, the body of this ruling figure is made up of basically all the different citizens of the countryside. And so they're, in a sense, like you see the back of their heads, they're turned almost in awe of this Leviathan figure. And you see the sort of like solemnity or like the kind of power or that he projected onto Leviathan. For Hobbes, it didn't necessarily have to be a monarch. Like he was open to sort of like different kinds of governance, but you can kind of see how this is working out. And for me, Bo, as a Catholic, what strikes me is it's almost like aping how we approach the Eucharist. So if you were to go into a Catholic church during, say, Eucharistic adoration, you would have a similar image, but everyone would be turned towards the Blessed Sacrament. Hobbes kind of flips that on its head, or he appropriates it, but now it's Leviathan, like the governing order that holds the awe of the people.
And what's interesting is clearly by the religious wars, in fact, in many ways how they start is ruling monarchs grasping for what will become absolutism. I mean, you can argue about very historically, whether they're absolute monarchs at that point or not. I don't know how you have someone like Henry VIII and not call him an absolute monarch, but I don't want to offend historians if they're listening. Clearly, we're well on the way to absolutist monarchy. And although it's certainly true throughout the Middle Ages and very much by right before the Reformation into the Reformation, you have people who go like, look, God made these people kings, and so they have divine right to do what they do, and they even make it sort of utilitarian, like, well, they kind of make the rules, they can bend the rules. I'm not denying any of that. But what you see with Hobbes is, at least even when people were justifying tyrant kings to rule, they at least thought they had to give lip service that God in his providence had given the sword to these kings. No longer with Hobbes. Hobbes says you have to have a Leviathan powerful enough and sort of given the awe that you would expect religious devotion to in order to have an institution powerful enough to grant what we as individuals could never do, either individually or just sort of banded together on our own accord, which is to say you have to grasp order from the throat of chaos. Chaos is first. Violence is first. All of that is primordial. And this starts to develop what will become the liberal, and I don't mean that like liberal conservative, like the liberal Enlightenment understanding of what the state must do, which is to say, even the liberal idea of like freedom starts to be, well, if you behave and give over your ability to commit violence against others, or eventually be like money and things like this, but like we give over, we hand over aspects of ourselves so that we are free from the violent interference of others. And that starts to be freedom. Freedom is we will police the borders so that people can't inflict violence on you. And your freedom is to do whatever you want. Like, again, to his point, he doesn't care if you're a monarch or not. He doesn't care if you're Catholic or not. You can be whatever, as long as you don't inflict what you're doing on someone else. And so a lot of these ideas about what freedom is even in the contemporary world, but that we still have in 2024, they start back then as pure negations of the only thing that can be wrested out of a life that he calls what? Brute, short, and mean, right?
Brute is short and nasty, I think.
Yeah. We're throwing in words too. Totally not tubular. Yeah. But the point being is not good, according to Hobbes.
Yeah, and so you hear all this, and I'm sure, Bo, there are listeners right now, and they think like, well, Hobbes was wrong, and I don't buy that. But the point that we're trying to make is that all of us in some ways are kind of inculcated in this culture. Like we're, you talk about like hazing at a fraternity or something. We go through this process as we go week to week because all the marketing and kind of like the way that our society is structured sort of it internalizes these kinds of ideas for us. And so even if we read Hobbes is wrong, like we're facing, like in some ways you could call it like a spiritual battle today. To give you an example, we talk about this in class. So not to give the impression by any means that like medieval Christendom was perfect, but to kind of contrast it with where we're at today, what we point out to our students is, look, if you were to visit, like say take a time machine to like 1350 France, I don't even know if France existed, like where France is today, or like the Franco culture or whatever.
Paris.
Yes. And you go to, again, a small medieval town or whatnot. What's at the center of the town? Well, of course, the largest, most visible structure in the center of the town is a church. And on Sundays, there might be the town drunk, or, like there are various people who, like, so to speak, like opt out of mass or whatnot. But in some ways, there's kind of like this cultural pressure, and it's you're kind of an oddball if you don't practice the Catholic faith, excepting, like some ethnic groups and things like that. And so at the heart of that culture is really the celebration of the Mass. And I've already mentioned like the way that lives and people were kind of like physically oriented towards the celebration of the Mass. You go to a major American town today, what's at the center of the town? Even here in Des Moines, it's usually like these large glass, quote unquote, cathedrals that are dedicated to what? To finance, maybe to entertainment. Like I think sporting venues have become sort of like new cathedrals for modern societies, but it gives you an impression of like the glue that holds people together. Whereas before, the celebration of the Eucharist and the incorporation into the mystical body of Christ gave the society this kind of shape or structure. We live in a society today where really all that binds us, I mean, it's just very thin. Like I'm united with my neighbors by sort of like concrete streets. And as a community here in Des Moines, I mean, I hope our parishes are sort of like counter societies, but really it's just like the pursuit of selfish ends, usually like financial gain, that sort of holds us together.
Well, and that binding together, right? So this is a way in which I think Hobbes was right about calling the wars, like the 30 Years' Wars and stuff, the wars of religion, but not how we typically mean it. Usually when we say the wars of religion, we go, oh, well, there are these sociological commitments called religion, and the Catholics and the Protestants fought. What I would say it was a war to determine what religion meant, and by this, you were getting this about binding together. So religion, again, some people will fight against this. I think this comes from Augustine, but one interpretation of where that word comes from etymologically is ligare, where we get the word ligament, right? That which binds. So religare, religion, that which binds over and over again. And so the 30 Years' War, so to speak, taught the lesson to Hobbes that it really didn't matter whether the virtue of religion, which is what used to that word meant. Religion was, it is, like if you read Thomas, virtue is a subset, religion is a subset of justice, right? It's the binding that you bind yourself to the Almighty. But what he saw it as is what could bind a society together is up for grabs. And so the Leviathan has to demand not our respect, our fealty, right? Like our willingness to give up our ability to inflict revenge so that it can create so what binds us together is the Leviathan policing the border. And so to your point, people go, well, I don't remember signing any social contract, but it's an implicit contract, right? That if you're going to live here, you must abide by these rules. So if you do things, not only like if you take violence into your own hands, but if you think that you can usurp the monopoly on power that Leviathan must have in order to bind us all together over against the primordial violence that is human life, Hobbes thinks you can rightfully be punished by the state, sent into exile by the state, or simply killed so that peace, so-called, that absence of war that is policed by the border that Leviathan symbolizes can be enacted. And then it can be, we give that authority the ability to ensure that that's the case. Well, Bud, with 2 minutes left, I think we've done a good job of pointing out why this is a very frightening understanding of peace, and one that is certainly deficient. What we're going to talk about when we get back from the break is what the Catholic understanding of peace is. And I will say, more than once in the old episode, we kept being like, you're probably imagining hippies or peace activists when you think of this. I don't know if people really do. I think that peace seems like it is this absence of war. And you can see this when people go like, oh, well, it's sort of like silence. Silence is the absence of noise. Like there's a lot of stuff, Bo and Bud, that we actually care about that are just the absence of stuff. So you can't mean that. I think we've shown in other episodes, right, that like, no, silence also has to be a positive thing, right? Like God speaks through silence. We've gone through these sort of things before. But if we don't have an idea of peace or like homeostasis, right? We think about medicine. What does it mean to be healthy? If health is just the absence of illness, again, that seems to make a doctor or the whole medical system think of you as a problem to be solved at all times. But if Thomas Aquinas, same thing with like if all teaching is the correction of error. But what's interesting, right, is Thomas points out that health is something actually your body tries to attain on its own, and it has this original health that a doctor simply helps it do what it does by nature. In that, we get the preview of what the church thinks about peace and even what the state is for. And when we get back, we will talk about that. We will define that, and I think show a much more compelling understanding of what peace and order is compared to Thomas Hobbes and what really is the sort of basis for a lot of modern political theory. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to be with you for 8 years. 8 years to the day we started here on Iowa Catholic Radio, The Uncommon Good. We are appreciative of every year and every listener. It has been a wonderful time. In order to celebrate that 8 years, the next series of shows that we're going to be doing is reconsidering those first shows that we did about the principles of Catholic social teaching. Once more, tipping the hat off to Bo and Bud of 8 years ago. We started with peace, the tranquility of order, and I, again, think that that's the right way to do that. We've certainly learned the tricks of the trade a lot more. We're better speakers, all of that sort of stuff, but I will say that original idea rings true today. We just got done with the first segment talking about the Hobbesian understanding of peace as a mere negation, right? Peace is the absence of war, and I hope we did a good job. We have much more time this time, Bud, because it was 30 minutes to start the show. Now we have an hour. I think we went into sufficient depth about what is lacking in this purely negative understanding of peace. So what we want to throw out is, in the Catholic social teaching, the idea of peace is called the tranquility of order. This is me ripping off Russell Hittinger, who talks about this, Pacem Terris, the great social encyclical that talks about this. Of course, Augustine speaks about this. But the idea that peace is not a negation, it's not just the absence of war, but it's the tranquility that comes with order, I think is revolutionary and will have very practical outcomes. That's something I would add that maybe we missed, I think, when we did this the first time, Bud, is there are very practical outcomes that must come about in leadership, for instance, if we think tranquility of order is a primordial reality that we've fallen away from and need to get back to, rather than the sort of thing that we wrestle from the mouth of a chaos monster.
Yeah, we try not to make the show like too bookish or classroom-like, but if you're taking notes at home, I think this is a term that's worth writing down and perhaps memorizing. Many are probably already familiar with it, but ontology, O-N-T-O-L-O-G-Y.
Ontology, what?
So when we're talking about Hobbes, he had what we call an ontology of violence. And so ontology is just a technical term for the study. It's like the philosophy of being, like the nature of the universe, the nature of reality.
Particularly beginnings.
The beginning of things, yeah. And so for Hobbes, at the beginning, like at the fundamental makeup of the universe is violent or chaotic. And really, so this episode, of course, is not about like evolutionary theory, but I think, and you know, like Catholics have wrestled with that idea a lot. And long story short, I think the development of Darwinian evolution and how it's used in the field of metaphysics, in the study of philosophy, it kind of accelerated that ontology of violence, because people assumed like if you have that explanation of the development of things, it's been driven by like death and by disorder, or it leads to kind of a sort of disorder. That's a really simplistic way of describing a very complicated concept. But long story short, most post-Enlightenment philosophers, I should say like of the non-theistic variety, have an ontology of violence and follow kind of the Hobbesian description in some sense.
And real quick, just to like point out so like we don't dismiss them very easily. So people going like, oh, so those are just those crazy postmoderns. Most modern economic theory is based on this. And I don't just mean the Marxist. I mean, nearly all of it assumes, this is where you'll hear creative destruction all the time, Bud. And so economically, people will like, oh, well, there must be losers. And so this theory in economics means wealth is only pride from lack. What's the very scarcity, right? Yeah. So if scarcity is first economically, just like you're saying with the sort of Darwinianism that becomes social Darwinianism, we're not explicated from this. So it's not just like, oh, the crazy philosophy professors, they've come up with this weird stuff. This ontology of violence pervades the market. And anytime you catch yourself saying like, well, there must be losers in a social order, you're kind of believing what Hobbes said. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's good. That's a very helpful point. But based on what we've just been talking about this episode, contrast that with what sacred scripture describes about the creation of the world. What's the one phrase that keeps recurring in Genesis 1? That God created it and he saw it and it was good, right? And God looks at all of creation and pronounces that divine blessing over it. And so at the heart of the Christian understanding of the world is not that in the beginning there was violence, but in the beginning there was peace. And as Bo has been trying to emphasize on today's show, it wasn't even just the absence of violence. It was that there was this ordering of things and this grace given to our first parents, wherein if they had lived into that and if they had embraced that, like they could have grown into what we call the beatific vision.
That's even why the creation is broken into 7 days, is to show, allegorically the order that is the peaceable creation of everything that exists.
So when you talk about practical application, my thought, first of all, and this does have social implications, we think about it in very individual terms, is hallowing the Sabbath, right? That there's this one day each week, and then that reverberates outward into how we like even think about months and honor like the years and things like that. But like we're called to set aside a day that's oriented to worship and to rest. And you can see how like what you call an ontology of violence or chaos has even sort of like filtered into how we think about that. Because for many of us today, myself unfortunately sometimes included, we think of honoring the Sabbath as kind of like, I do take my family to mass, but it's like sort of the absence of work. And, like I can, even my recreation becomes a kind of task on the checklist that I check off.
Yeah, we recharge batteries in order to get back to the 5 days of making things which are made only through destruction of other things.
Yeah. But at the beginning, what the Bible calls peace, again, I think we could go back to the Hebrew and it's the term shalom. And so it is this kind of fullness. Like I think about good silence as pregnant silence. It's filled with a kind of rest on my part and a recognition of the presence of God. Peace is the same way. It's not that we've wrested something from a primeval violence or disorder, but it's that we're actually rooted in the original intention of creation. The Greek term for this sort of thing is like pleroma. It just has this idea of, again, a kind of fullness. And it's interesting because in Scripture, the kind of things that human beings suffer under now, sort of like servile labor, pain in childbirth, the constant like recognition that we're mortal and that our lives are like circumscribed by the threat of our own deaths and things like that. Those are falling away from that original fullness or shalom. And then, but what God is calling us to, what the salvific plan is about, is pulling all creation, and maybe that's not even the best word, but bringing creation to this sort of completion where it is a Sabbath rest. And that's why, one of my favorite writers about these things is really St. Augustine, because he really draws on that idea of like, we're called to this kind of Sabbath existence, and the beatific vision, our eternal communion with God, will be like not simply a return to the original Sabbath, but the sort of like full outworking of it.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to keep talking about St. Augustine, because if you think we're being sort of, love children hippies, where's that joke again, about like, everything can be okay, why don't we just get along? St. Augustine is not some sort of, happy-dappy dude. Most people blame him for like the pessimism that ends in Thomas Hobbes. But what's interesting, right, is as much as St. Augustine can be down on the effects of sin, original sin, and in his most grumpy, very pessimistic about how many people can actually enter into the Sabbath rest, but still for him even grumpy old St. Augustine, peace is first. We've lost our way. Maybe we've very much lost our way, but the goal is to return to that, like you said. So a politics not of resting, an absence from, like you said, a primordial chaos, a politics of return. Mm-hmm. So even when we have to think about the state in terms of its the punishment it maybe has to dole out, the taxes it has to extricate from us, even the polis utilizing its most forceful conscripting arms of how it works, all of that has to be seen as a politics of return to something original and not creating an absence out of a positive that is very, very, very bad.
Yeah, when we talk about these things too, I think there can be a temptation, like Bo and I can kind of sound like Gnostics. And what I mean by that is there was this like ancient heresy and groups even outside of Christianity that talked about this gnosis, or sort of like esoteric knowledge, that you could kind of achieve salvation through these sort of secrets. And of course, Christianity has never been a secret. It's a public proclamation. But when I talk about like not falling into Gnosticism, like we don't talk about these ideas just so like you can score extra points on, like if Jeopardy ever has a Catholic round or something like that. Right. Or even like I know what needs to be known now, and so like those schmucks on the ground, they don't really realize like what we're facing. No, it really is. I mean, I think about St. Paul. He talks about the renewal of our minds, like the transformation of how we see the world. And the first step in that sometimes is recognizing sort of like the messaging that we're receiving on a daily basis. And it's not a kind of Gnosticism. It's like a totally different way of, like, it's a different sort of practice. So what I think about is recently on the show, we were talking about baptism. Like baptism, by virtue of the sacrament itself, it's calling you into a different order. And what's fascinating about the early Christians, and we do uphold the early Christians for their sort of faithfulness in the face of persecution and things, is on one level, they were the best of citizens. Like if you could count on people for like integrity and like a willingness to go the extra mile, things like that, they were there. But they also recognized that their ultimate Caesar, you could say, was not the emperor, but it was Christ himself. So they provocatively said Christ is Lord, like Christ is Caesar in some sense, right? And so that meant that there were certain things, the phrase that is often bandied about is like the pinch of incense, right? That they wouldn't offer to the gods. Or like certain, like of course, like participation in like temple rituals that were against the moral teachings of the faith. And so they became this kind of counter society. And I point the early Christians out because today it's not a perfect one-to-one analogy, but we're facing a situation more like that. It's probably closer to what the early Christians faced than to Christendom, right? And so we have to begin to ask ourselves, how as parishes, how as families, how as people bound together by this common confession of the creed, how do we become this kind of alternative society? Because another temptation is to say like, well, we have to bring our own society back to what's right. And I'm fine with that idea. But oftentimes we fall into this kind of mindset of thinking, well, we can do that through like voting the right people into office. And it's like, if we just use the levers of electoral politics, like cleverly enough, we'll get to that point that we're reaching. Well, I think what actually Christ is calling to us to is something more interesting, but also more challenging. And it begins with witnessing to a different way of life. And so we have to have our lives ordered to, like, we could call it an ontology of peace. That's probably too like fancy for what we're thinking about, but it really is discipleship. It's just discipleship, not simply like as an individual Christian, but as communities of faith.
Well, I like that you brought up baptism, because actually I think maybe an image to keep in mind is water, funny enough. So for a lot of cultures, water is seen as the chaos monster. I mean, so let's just talk about Babylon, where I think a lot of this sort of interplay ends up in the Old Testament into the New. Tiamat is sort of their version of Leviathan. I think you know it better. I don't think I'm talking completely out of school. We can get Matthew Umbarger on to correct us if I'm wrong. But this idea is like you start to see in all sorts of epics, like the Babylonian one, where you have a monster that's like this sea monster, and some original hero kills the monster and then like uses its teeth to make people and the blood to make the oceans and its body to make the skies. I mean, you get this idea again of wrestling chaos. What's interesting is in the biblical narrative, how often water, which can symbolize death, is almost always being calmed by God. Yeah. So Jesus walks on water and calms the storm. Or you think about at the very beginning of creation, the Spirit of God hovers over the waters, right, and brings order out of them, and not like wrestles it from some sort of primordial chaos dragon. But the very interesting one is when God talks about Leviathan in Job, where we don't get this like God fought Leviathan because he was so wicked. God thinks Leviathan's cool. Yeah. God talks about Leviathan like your uncle talked about the pet alligator he wasn't supposed to have. I mean, so God is just really like effusive about the beauty even in this very scary creature, the Leviathan. So instead of saying that, like, oh, well, you have to submit all of your sort of nascent power to this even more powerful being in order to wrest, some semblance of order out of chaos, God even sees like the sort of power of the oceans and the waters as a way to bring about peace. And so baptism is that witness that you start to talk about, that because we believe Jesus Christ has died and risen, we believe that peace is already in breaking. We don't have to wrestle it out, of the alligator of the world. We believe that it's already in breaking, and are we willing to be the beachhead of the inbreaking of that peace rather than the wresting of it away, with violence? And so I think about this, but like if peace is tranquility rather than a secured, emptied, inside border, like that on the outside is chaos. This is where asceticism has everything to do with political order. If we can have a tranquility of heart, if we can make the waters of our desire calm down, if we can tread upon the waters of our desires, we become the sort of citizen in the world that doesn't add to the frenzy of the troubled waters, that the rest of the world, the desires that are just a cacophony of waves splashing against each other, that the devil and the demons, are whipping up these tsunamis of desire and mimetic violence. That's one of the things we can do by being baptized and witnessing to our baptism, as it were, the calm living waters of baptism that, like Psalm 42 gets at.
Yeah, and as we're having this conversation, you could really structure this conversation in interesting ways just around the sacraments. Because on the first segment, you mentioned this economics of scarcity. I think that was the first segment. It feels so long ago. But this, where we start with, as we think about the economy, we start with the notion of scarcity and then work from there. Like the Eucharist is really the counter narrative to the economics of scarcity. And in the celebration of the Mass, our Lord offers his very body and blood to us. And it's like, I was going to say in some ways, but really like it's this, in the Gospels, he tells the woman at the well, like anyone who drinks of this living water will never thirst again.
Right.
Like your ancestors ate of the manna in the desert and they still died, but anyone who eats my flesh and drinks my blood will live forever. So the gifts that God gives us, there's no economics of scarcity. It's total abundance, right? God gives us all the gifts that we need to be faithful. And that kind of transforms how we think about a lot of things. We have a few minutes left, and I don't want to broach like really controversial topics that we can't address like in due justice, but think about things like the migrant. And I know that's sort of a heated topic today, but what if that person is a member of the body of Christ? Even if they're not, it's still the presence of Christ in our midst, right? Like we encounter him in the least of these. Or something like nuclear weapons, where we kind of have created this like international order where we say what's going to assure peace is mutually assured self-destruction, and we're all going to want to avoid that. So we'll create these massive weapons that could basically wipe out entire nations. And in some ways, like as Christians, unfortunately, like we just kind of fall for that way of thinking. Like we see like the homeless person in our midst as more like a threat or a nuisance than someone in which we can encounter Christ. But if we're formed in the Eucharist and each week God gives us his very body and blood and those gifts don't run out, like I think it gives us the opportunity to make radical sacrifices and to trust not that the social order will look a certain way, but that God will make things right in the end, and that we're living into that way of life.
Yeah, none of this is easy work. I think sometimes, we can get accused of Gnosticism, and then the other can be like, oh, you're idealist, that if everybody just decides peace is good, we'll all fall into line. And clearly that's not the case. No.
A future show will be about justice.
That's right. And peace, right? Like, the Prince of Peace got killed by this world, right? So if Christ is going to get killed by this world, so will we. But that's the interesting part about his willingness to die for others, because he doesn't have an economic scarcity. He trusted the word of what his father said and knew he'd be resurrected. And I think about that in terms of like what St. Vincent de Paul says about the poor. It's not that the poor is like, it's good policy, or you should feel bad, or you should help them out, because Jesus does not believe in a policy of scarcity because of the peace and tranquility that is at the center of the Trinity. When he said, as you do to these least of my brothers, you do that unto me. That is a sort of overabundance, but that's like the best conversion deal you can have economically, right? Yeah. That is God being like spending, as it were, through grace in a way that's not even economical at all. He's effusive, right, with the good deal he's giving you. And so St. Vincent de Paul says we should call the poor our masters, because if we work for them, the overabundance of how they will speak on our behalf at the end of time, and we will reap the abundant rewards for serving them as masters. None of that's going to be sexy or good or easy, but that because we believe in the tranquility of order that is at the heart of the Trinity, the heart of the human heart of Jesus Christ, that we can imitate that we can witness to a different way, and that it's more foundational. And even though we've lost it, we've gone away from it, that it's possible to return back to that. So this is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We have been celebrating 8 wonderful years here on Iowa Catholic Radio. We started the show 8 years ago. I think we've learned a lot. In those 8 years, not only is it a better sounding product, the quality just magnifique. I actually think there was much between the intervening years.
Well, what I realized as we were doing this episode is that's a really difficult topic to address in an hour.
Yeah.
You said the first show was half an hour?
Yeah, no, we barely.
I don't know how I'd like to go back and listen to just how we handled that.
It was over in a blink.
Well, speaking of over in a blink, no, I can't do Bo's transitions. I just don't have that gift. But if you do want to join us in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio, please do. We pray the rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. Then in the afternoon, 2:55 p.m., we broadcast the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. You're also able to use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
And if you want to make sure to be a part of what Iowa Catholic Radio is up to in and around the Diocese of Des Moines and the listening area in general, it's easy to go to iowacatholicradio.com and look at the events. Coming up is the big one, Bud, September 28th through 29th over at Wells Fargo Arena. Christ Our Life Conference. Join Iowa Catholic Radio for a weekend of faith-sharing, faith-building, and praise. World-class speakers and renowned Catholic exhibitors, and we'll come together to share in the sacraments. Tickets and more info available at iowacatholicradio.com. And then, of course, October 1st through 4th, we have the fall fundraiser. It takes all of us to teach, defend, and evangelize. Tune in all week long as we highlight the very best of Catholic educators and the importance of teaching the faith as we look to fund the mission of Iowa Catholic Radio for the remainder of 2024. And, Bud, I think that's the best way to segue into talking about that, is this is a ministry that's not just the people on air, behind the boards, or behind the desks. It is your ministry as well. If you're listening to this, this is your ministry. We want to say thank you for all that you do to make it possible. Your prayers make it possible. Your volunteer time makes it possible. But certainly your material support through donations makes this ministry what it is. We can't exist without you. We want to thank everybody who's given before, but we do deeply hope that you can prayerfully consider giving more. 515-223-1150. You can call or text, or you can go to iowacatholicradio.com and hit the donate button. People would be glad to hear from you. Thank you for everyone who's given before, but we can't say enough. You make this possible. You make 8 years of the Uncommon Good possible. We certainly are grateful, and we are glad to be a part of Iowa Catholic Radio and your listening experience. Bud, like I said, hard to show any other thankfulness to everybody for the time they've given than to go back and consider the roots of the show. I hope that's how you Iowa say. I say roots, but the roots of this show. And I hope much peace and tranquility to everybody who got a chance to be with us today.
My only disappointment with today's episode is we didn't get the chance to talk about football results last week. There were some interesting outcomes, but it's probably better for the peace of my relationships that we left it alone.
I was going to say the tranquility of people's sports. What's the right way to say this? Their sports allegiances, but this is pretty early in the year to have that tranquility disturbed. Do you think they'll be able to wrest it back?
Well, I'm kind of I tend to be a little superstitious with sports, so it's best for me if I refrain from any smack talk until the season is over. And my beloved Huskers still have an important game in Iowa City Black Friday. So
I do know that my heart had very little peace and tranquility for Oklahoma State until double overtime was over. I see my kids getting into football, and I sometimes wonder if I've cursed them rather than blessed them. But hey, a victory is a victory, and I hope that everybody has a wonderful weekend with her family. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, cities, nation, planet, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.